I'm a 911 dispatcher at Riverside County Emergency Communications in Thornfield, Washington. Or at least I was, until I requested a transfer to records management last month. You can call me Dr. Elena Vasquez if you want to mean it, though most people in the communications center just called me the doc. During my 16 years there, I've handled everything you can imagine in emergency dispatch: cardiac arrests, structure fires, active shooters, multi-vehicle accidents, missing persons cases, and every kind of crisis that can unfold in a mountainous region where civilization meets wilderness. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one call that made me question everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the living and the dead, and ultimately led me to step away from active emergency response entirely. Riverside County Emergency Communications serves a vast territory of 3,200 square miles that stretches from the foothills of the Cascade Mountains to dense old-growth forests that have stood untouched for centuries. It's a region where technology struggles against geography, where GPS signals disappear beneath thick canopies of Douglas fir and cedar, and where some properties are so remote that emergency responders need detailed topographical maps just to locate them. During my 16 years behind that console, I coordinated responses to wilderness emergencies, search and rescue operations that lasted for days, and incidents that occurred in places so isolated that the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away through impassable terrain. The call I'm about to describe began long before that November night, when my headset buzzed with an incoming emergency that would shatter my understanding of what's possible in this world. It started with a property that had been sitting vacant for over 4 decades, hidden on 63 acres of dense forest approximately 18 miles southeast of Thornfield. The Blackwood Estate, as locals called it, carried a history that most people in the area preferred to forget, and a reputation that kept even the most adventurous urban explorers away after sunset. To understand why this case affected me so profoundly, you need to know about my background before I became a 911 dispatcher. I wasn't always Dr. Elena Vasquez, emergency communications specialist. For 12 years before I entered dispatch work, I was Dr. Elena Vasquez, clinical psychologist specializing in trauma therapy, dissociative disorders, and severe PTSD cases that other therapists found too challenging to handle. I had worked extensively with combat veterans experiencing flashbacks so vivid they couldn't distinguish past from present, survivors of childhood abuse who had developed complex dissociative identities, and patients whose minds had fractured in ways that created entirely alternate realities. I had seen every form of psychological break that the human mind could endure, every type of hallucination that trauma could produce, and every variety of delusional thinking that could emerge from a damaged psyche. During those 12 years in clinical practice, I developed what I considered to be an unshakable ability to distinguish between genuine psychological distress and attention-seeking behavior, between medication-induced perceptual disturbances and elaborate fantasy systems created by disturbed minds. I understood the neuroscience behind hallucinations, the psychology of false memories, and the way that suggestion and environmental factors could influence people to believe they had experienced things that never actually occurred. When I transitioned to emergency dispatch work in 2007, primarily due to emotional exhaustion from years of absorbing other people's trauma, I brought that clinical skepticism and analytical training with me. I thought I had an advantage over my colleagues because I could quickly identify callers who might be experiencing psychiatric emergencies disguised as other types of crises. In 16 years of dispatch work, I had fielded literally hundreds of calls from people reporting what they believed to be supernatural or paranormal experiences, disembodied voices calling for help from empty houses, shadowy figures moving through abandoned buildings, mysterious lights floating through the forest, objects moving by themselves, and electronic equipment malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Each time, I approached these calls with the same methodical professionalism I had used in my psychological practice: gather detailed information, assess the caller's mental state, dispatch appropriate personnel if there was any possibility of a legitimate emergency, and maintain comprehensive documentation for follow-up investigation. My colleagues began referring the more unusual and bizarre emergency calls to my station because my psychological background made me particularly effective at managing callers who might be experiencing mental health crises, substance-induced hallucinations, or stress-related perceptual disturbances. I became the unofficial department expert for handling what we diplomatically termed anomalous incident reports. The vast majority of these paranormal emergency calls had perfectly rational explanations that became apparent during investigation. Settling foundations and shifting wood created ghostly footsteps in old houses. Automotive headlights reflecting off windows or water created mysterious floating orbs of light. Wild animals moving through dense underbrush became sinister stalking presences. Weather phenomena, optical illusions and equipment malfunctions accounted for most of the remaining unexplained reports. In the rare cases where callers seemed genuinely distressed by experiences that couldn't be immediately explained, I usually found that mental health episodes, prescription medication interactions, illegal drug use, or simple misperception under stressful conditions provided logical answers. My clinical training had taught me that the human mind, particularly under stress, fatigue, or emotional duress, could create remarkably convincing perceptual experiences that felt completely real to the person experiencing them. This is where the Blackwood estate enters my story, though I wouldn't actually receive a call from that location for many years. The 63-acre property had been owned by the Blackwood family since 1952. When retired lumber baron Harrison Blackwood constructed an elaborate Victorian mansion deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound 3 miles through dense timber from the nearest public highway. Harrison lived in the mansion with his wife, Catherine, and their twin daughters, Melody and Harmony, until the spring of 1981, when the entire family vanished without a trace during a single night in May. I mean vanished completely. Their vehicles remained in the circular driveway, house keys were found on the kitchen counter, fresh flowers were still arranged in vases throughout the house, and half-finished meals were discovered on the dining room table, but the 4 family members had simply disappeared. The initial missing persons investigation was massive and unprecedented for our rural county. Search teams combed every acre of the surrounding forest for months. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment scanned the canopy looking for heat signatures. Professional tracking dogs followed scent trails that led from the house into the woods and then inexplicably terminated, as if the family had somehow been lifted into the air and carried away. Federal investigators joined the search when local resources were exhausted. They found no evidence of violence, no signs of forced entry, no indication of financial problems or family conflicts that might have motivated a planned disappearance, and absolutely no logical explanation for how 4 people could simultaneously vanish from a house that showed no signs of disturbance or struggle. After 18 months of intensive investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, the case was officially classified as unsolved but remained active. The property eventually reverted to county ownership when no living relatives could be located to claim the estate. For more than 4 decades, the Blackwood mansion sat empty, slowly deteriorating in the relentless Pacific Northwest rain and isolation. During my years in emergency dispatch, the Blackwood property generated occasional calls that crossed my console. Lost hikers who stumbled onto the abandoned mansion while trying to navigate back to established trails, county workers who needed access to the property for environmental surveys or fire prevention inspections, forestry personnel who reported unusual wildlife behavior in the area surrounding the house. Periodically, I would receive calls from people claiming to have observed unexplained phenomena at the Blackwood estate. Lights moving behind the boarded windows of the mansion, sounds of music or laughter echoing from the supposedly empty building, figures moving across the overgrown grounds during daylight hours when no one should have been on the property. I always approached these reports with my standard clinical skepticism and professional detachment. Abandoned buildings naturally attract transients, drug users, vandals, and curious teenagers looking for thrills. Unusual lights could easily be explained by flashlights, emergency flares, or even reflected sunlight hitting glass or metal surfaces at specific angles. Sounds could be attributed to animals nesting in the structure, wind moving through broken windows and doors, or the natural settling and creaking of old wood and deteriorating building materials. My first direct professional involvement with the Blackwood estate occurred in April 2021, when I dispatched sheriff's deputies to investigate a report from a utility worker who claimed to have seen smoke rising from one of the mansion's chimneys during a routine power line inspection. The responding officers found the house exactly as it had been for decades. Every window boarded shut, all doors secured with heavy chains and padlocks, no evidence of recent human presence anywhere on the property, and certainly no fire in any of the multiple fireplaces that hadn't been used since the 1980s. The utility worker insisted he had clearly seen dark smoke rising from the central chimney, but the deputies found no ash, no char marks, no scent of recent burning, and no possible way that anyone could have accessed the interior of the building to start a fire. They filed a routine incident report documenting the workers' claim alongside their negative findings, and I added the report to the growing file of unexplained but ultimately harmless incidents associated with the property. This pattern of periodic, inexplicable reports continued for the next 2 years. Every few months someone would call to report strange lights, mysterious sounds, or unexplained activity at the Blackwood estate. Every investigation yielded the same results: no evidence of human presence, no logical explanation for the reported phenomena, and no indication that any actual emergency or criminal activity was occurring. I developed a standard protocol for handling Blackwood-related calls: take detailed statements from the reporting parties, dispatch patrol units for wellness checks and security sweeps, document all findings thoroughly, and file the reports in the ever-expanding folder of unexplained incidents that had accumulated over the decades. I approached each call with professional courtesy, but private skepticism, confident that rational explanations existed for every reported anomaly, even if we couldn't immediately identify what those explanations might be. The property had become something of a local legend, the subject of ghost stories and urban legends that circulated among teenagers and amateur paranormal investigators. Online forums dedicated to supposedly haunted locations frequently mentioned the Blackwood estate, with users sharing second-hand accounts of supernatural encounters and encouraging others to visit the site. I had learned to recognize the difference between calls from people who had actually visited the property and those who were simply repeating stories they had heard online or from friends. The genuine sightings, while still unexplained, followed certain consistent patterns and usually came from credible witnesses with no apparent motivation to fabricate reports. The second-hand accounts were typically more dramatic, less specific, and often contradicted known facts about the property's layout and accessibility. By November 2023, I had handled dozens of Blackwood estate calls over the course of my career. Each one had been carefully investigated, thoroughly documented, and ultimately filed away as unexplained but non-threatening. I had developed a mental categorization system for these reports: probable misidentification of natural phenomena, possible equipment malfunction, likely pranksters or trespassers, and definite psychological factors affecting the witness's perception. This established pattern of routine investigations and rational skepticism continued until November 15, 2023. It was a Tuesday night, unusually cold for mid-November, with a thick fog bank that had rolled in from Puget Sound. and reduced visibility throughout the county to less than 50 feet. I was working the graveyard shift, which typically involved medical emergencies from our aging rural population, domestic disturbances that escalated during long winter nights, and the occasional drunk driving incident from people who underestimated the dangerous combination of mountain roads and impaired judgment. At exactly 3:23 a.m., my console received an incoming 911 call that would fundamentally alter everything I believed about the nature of reality, the boundaries between life and death, and the limitations of human understanding. The caller ID displayed the location as 847 Shadowbrook Lane, the precise address of the Blackwood estate that had been abandoned and empty for 42 years. When I saw that caller ID flash across my screen, 847 Shadowbrook Lane, my first instinct was to assume it was a system error. Phone lines to the Blackwood estate had been disconnected in 1983, 2 years after the family's disappearance. There was no possible way for a call to originate from that location. I had dispatched crews to that property dozens of times over the years, and I knew for certain that no active telephone service existed anywhere on those 63 acres. But the call was coming through, and my training kicked in automatically. I put on my headset and activated the recording system. 911, what's your emergency? The voice that came through my headset stopped my heart cold. It was a woman, young, maybe in her 20s, speaking in a tone of controlled panic that I had heard thousands of times before from people in genuine crisis. But there was something else in her voice, a quality I couldn't immediately identify that made every instinct I had developed in 16 years of emergency dispatch start screaming warnings. Please, you have to help us. They're in the house. So we can hear them moving around downstairs, and we're trapped up here with the girls. I immediately began following standard protocol, even as my mind raced to process what I was hearing. Ma'am, can you tell me your location? We're at the Blackwood place on Shadowbrook Lane. Please, we need help now. They're trying to get upstairs. The caller knew the exact address. She knew the family name associated with the property, but that was impossible. The Blackwood estate had been abandoned for over 4 decades. No one lived there. No one could live there. The building had been condemned by the county, sealed, and was completely uninhabitable. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me your name? Catherine. Catherine Blackwood. Please, you have to send someone. They're at the bottom of the stairs now. My blood turned to ice. Catherine Blackwood had been the wife of Harrison Blackwood. Catherine Blackwood had disappeared in 1981. Catherine Blackwood would be in her 80s if she were still alive, not speaking with the voice of a young woman in her 20s. I quickly accessed our database while keeping the caller on the line. The system showed no active residents at 847 Shadowbrook Lane, no utilities connected to the property, no one authorized to be on the premises. According to every official record we had, the location was vacant and had been for 42 years. Catherine, are you injured? Do you or your family need medical attention? We're not hurt, but we're terrified. Harrison tried to go downstairs to see who it was, but they did something to him. He started screaming, and then he just stopped. We can't see him anymore. In the background of the call, I could hear what sounded like children crying, young girls, their voices high and frightened. I could also hear what the caller was describing, heavy footsteps on wooden floors, the sound of doors opening and closing, and a low rhythmic noise that I couldn't identify, but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. Catherine, I'm going to send officers to your location right now. Can you tell me how many people are in the house with you? It's me and the twins, Melody and Harmony. They're only 9 years old, and they're so scared. Harrison went downstairs maybe 10 minutes ago, and now we can't reach him. Those things, they're moving through the house, like they're looking for something. Melody and Harmony, the twin daughters who had disappeared with their parents in 1981, who would now be in their 50s if they were still alive, not 9 years old, not crying in the background of a phone call that couldn't possibly be happening. I dispatched every available unit to the Blackwood estate, 4 patrol cars, 2 paramedic units, and our crisis response team, Code 3, lights and sirens, full emergency response. Even as I was coordinating the dispatch, part of my mind was trying to find rational explanations for what I was experiencing. Someone was obviously playing an elaborate hoax. They had somehow managed to restore phone service to the abandoned property, researched the history of the Blackwood family, and was now calling in a fake emergency, using the names of the people who had disappeared decades ago. It was sick and twisted, but it was the only logical explanation. But the voice on the phone, Catherine Blackwood, sounded genuinely terrified. I had spent years learning to distinguish between real fear and manufactured drama, and every instinct I had told me that this woman was experiencing authentic, overwhelming terror. Catherine, I need you to stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Can you tell me what these intruders look like? We can't see them clearly. They're like shadows that move wrong. They don't walk like people should walk, and the sound they make. She paused, and I could hear her breathing heavily. It's like they're dragging something heavy across the floor. Are all the doors and windows in the house locked? Yes, everything was locked when we went to bed. That's what's so frightening. We don't know how they got in. Harrison checked all the doors before we went upstairs, and nothing was open. The 1st Patrol Unit reached the Blackwood estate 12 minutes after I dispatched them. Officer Rebecca Martinez radioed in from the property perimeter. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I'm at the Shadowbrook location. The property appears completely dark and abandoned. No vehicles in the driveway. No lights visible in any windows. All access points appear to be secured with chains and padlocks as expected. No signs of current occupancy. But Catherine was still on the phone with me, still describing the intruders moving through her house, still pleading for help for herself and her daughters. Unit 7, the caller is still on the line, reporting an active emergency inside the residence. Can you make contact with the occupants? Dispatch, I'm going to need clarification here. The building appears to be completely sealed. Every window is boarded up, and the main entrance is chained shut. There's no way anyone could be inside this structure. I looked at my console. The call was still active, still showing as originating from 847 Shadowbrook Lane. I could still hear Catherine breathing, could still hear the children crying in the background, could still hear those terrible dragging sounds moving through the house. Catherine, the officers are outside the house now. Can you see their lights through the windows? What officers? There are no lights outside. It's completely dark out there. Are you sure they're here? Officer Martinez's voice came through my radio again. Dispatch, I am going to attempt entry to the property. Something's not right here. Over the next 20 minutes, I listened to the most surreal coordination effort of my career. 4 officers worked to remove chains and boards from the main entrance of the Blackwood estate, while Catherine Blackwood remained on the phone with me, describing an active home invasion that no one outside the house could detect any evidence of. When the officers finally gained entry to the mansion, they found exactly what I had expected. A house that had been empty for 42 years. Dust-covered furniture, boarded windows, no electricity, no running water, and certainly no functioning telephone from which someone could place a 911.
But Catherine was still talking to me. They're at the bedroom door now. They're trying to get in. Please, where are the police you said you were sending? Unit 7, what's your status inside the residence? Dispatch, we've cleared the 1st floor. The house is completely empty. There's no sign that anyone has been here recently. Heavy dust everywhere, no footprints, no disturbance to anything. It's like a museum that's been sealed for decades. The impossible contradiction continued for another 37 minutes. Officers searched every room of the Blackwood mansion, while Catherine Blackwood described a home invasion that they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and found no evidence of. I stayed on the phone with her, following my training to maintain contact with callers in crisis, even as every logical part of my mind rejected what was happening. The call ended abruptly at 4:47 a.m., not with a hang-up, not with the sound of a phone being disconnected, but but with a scream that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. Catherine Blackwood screamed, the children screamed, and then there was silence. When I tried to call back, the number was disconnected. When I checked our system logs, they showed that no call had ever been received from 847 Shadowbrook Lane that night. According to our official records, no 911 call had been placed from that location in the 42 years since the property had been abandoned, but I had the recording. 4 hours and 24 minutes of conversation with Catherine Blackwood, who had disappeared in 1981. 4 hours of background sounds that included children who should have been middle-aged women if they were still alive. 4 hours of impossible communication with people who couldn't possibly have been in a house that had been empty for over 4 decades. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 months of my life. I submitted every piece of evidence to experts in audio analysis, telephone system technology, and digital communications. The recording was analyzed by federal investigators, university researchers, and private consultants who specialized in debunking paranormal claims. No one could explain how the call had been placed. The telephone infrastructure to the Blackwood estate had been physically removed in 1983. No cell towers provided coverage to that remote location. No internet service existed in the area. No known technology could have generated a call that appeared to originate from that address. More disturbing was the analysis of Catherine's voice. Speech pattern experts compared my recording to historical audio of the real Catherine Blackwood from local news interviews recorded before her disappearance. The vocal characteristics, speech patterns, and even the slight southern accent were identical. The children's voices in the background matched the ages that Melody and Harmony Blackwood would have been in 1981, 9 years old, just as Catherine had told me during the call. I requested a transfer to administrative duties 3 weeks after submitting my final report on the incident. I couldn't continue working active dispatch, couldn't trust my own judgment anymore about what was real and what was impossible. Every call that came through my headset made me question whether I was speaking to someone in the present day or receiving communications from somewhere and someone else entirely. The case of the Blackwood Estate 911 call remains classified as unexplained in our department files. It's studied by researchers, referenced in papers about anomalous communications, and cited as one of the most well-documented examples of paranormal emergency contact on record. But for me, the call represents something more disturbing than a simple ghostly communication. It suggests that the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead, may be far more fluid than we understand. If Catherine Blackwood could place a 911 call 42 years after her disappearance, if her family could be trapped in some kind of temporal loop repeating the night they vanished, then how many other impossible things might be happening around us every day that we simply dismiss because they don't fit our understanding of reality? The most haunting question I carry with me is this: if I had somehow been able to send help to Catherine Blackwood that night, if there had been a way to reach across 4 decades of time and space to rescue her family from whatever took them in 1981, could I have prevented their disappearance? Could I have changed history itself? I still listen to that recording sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I hear the terror in Catherine's voice, the crying of children who should have grown up to have children of their own, and the sounds of something moving through that house that defied every natural law I thought I understood. The Blackwood estate was demolished by the county 6 months after my call. The official reason was structural instability and public safety concerns. But I know the real reason: no one wanted to risk receiving another call from 847 Shadowbrook Lane. Some mysteries are too dangerous to leave unsolved, and some calls from the past are too terrifying to answer twice. 6 months after I transferred to records management, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a manila envelope containing photocopied documents from the original 1981 investigation into the Blackwood family's disappearance. Files that had been sealed by federal authorities and were not part of the public record. What I found in those documents changed everything I thought I understood about that November night. The lead investigator's personal notes, written in the margins of official reports, told a different story than what had been released to the public. Agent Sarah Chen had documented several disturbing discoveries that were never included in the final case summary. On the night the Blackwood family disappeared, neighbors reported hearing screaming coming from the direction of the estate around 3:30 a.m. Multiple witnesses described the sounds as a woman and children crying for help. The screaming lasted for approximately 40 minutes before abruptly stopping. When investigators arrived the next morning, they found something that was never reported to the media. The telephone in the master bedroom was off the hook, and the line was still active. The phone company had no record of any outgoing calls placed from the residents that night, but the line showed continuous usage from 3:23 a.m. until 4:47 a.m. near exactly the same time duration as my call with Catherine Blackwood. Agent Chen's handwritten notes included a chilling detail. It's as if they were trying to call for help, but the call went nowhere. The line was open, but no one was listening on the other end. The most disturbing revelation was found in the basement of the mansion during the original investigation. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators discovered evidence of previous disappearances dating back to the 1950s. Personal belongings, identification documents, and journal entries from at least 7 other families who had lived on the property over the decades. All had vanished without explanation during the same time of year, mid-November. The final document in the package was Agent Chen's personal recommendation, stamped classified in red ink, recommend permanent closure of the property. Evidence suggests the location may be experiencing some form of temporal displacement or recurring event that poses a significant risk to human life. Under no circumstances should the property be inhabited or investigated further. But here's what truly terrifies me. Agent Chen's notes included detailed transcripts of interviews with neighbors from 1981. When asked about the screaming they heard that night, several witnesses mentioned hearing a woman repeatedly shouting the same phrases I had heard Catherine say during our call 42 years later. "Please, you have to help us. They're in the house. Where are the police you said you were sending?" The exact words, spoken in 1981, that I would hear again in 2023. I've come to a horrifying conclusion. Catherine Blackwood wasn't calling me from the past. She was trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same night over and over again for 42 years. Every November 15th, the Blackwood family experiences their final night, tries to call for help, and disappears again into whatever darkness claimed them. The reason no one could help them in 1981 was the same reason I couldn't help them in 2023, because they weren't calling from our reality. They were calling from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that exists parallel to our world but remains forever out of reach. I destroyed the documents after reading them. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, but I can't destroy what I learned from them, that there are places in this world where time doesn't work the way it should, where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the dead continue to seek help that will never come. Every November 15th since then, I stay awake all night, wondering if somewhere in the darkness, Catherine Blackwood is placing another 911 call that will never reach anyone in time to save her family. The most terrifying part isn't that I answered a call from the dead, it's that I might answer it again. And next time I'm not sure I'll be strong enough to hang up.